that an Explorer or a Bronco?
I don't know, but the the real killer of OJ's wife and her boyfriend was in the car apparently.
All righty then. 17th of June, 5 p.m. ish. This and that. Welcome to This and That information. Later tonight, if you're just tuning in and you're actually listening and watching, there will be writers workshop and of course sports tonight. A lot of sports going on actually with the Olympics coming up. So This and That. It's a summary by Simon Clarke of volume 3 of Marx's Capital. And yes, it is deadly dull for some folks, but I'm just finishing it off. Today we'll finish with the synopsis, which is only essentially 20, 8 by 11 pages of text. And so it's not very long, and this will give you just kind of an overview of where Andy Higginbottom will go next year, and what. Just to remind folks that there are 3 volumes, technically 4, and they're important to get a sense of issues about the kind of interaction with certain theoretical concepts like surplus value and other matters. So we'll just bomb through this fairly quickly, and you can look at other summaries if you like. But volume 3 is most people don't get to volume 3, even though it's partially because it is kind of fragmentary. It does require a little bit of thinking and adding and silly math and stuff like that. I've included some resources in today's presentation, a couple of videos and it's got the math in it, some math, and lest you think that's unimportant, there's a literature on Marxist math. It's a weird little variant of basic calculus. Ultimately, that's kind of where he was headed. Um, there are manuscripts, mathematical manuscripts by Marx, some of which either help or hinder this particular process. And most people who wind up looking at this stuff from a mathematical point of view, usually don't overburden the math, thank God. But they usually just work through this algebra thing, and it is pretty basic for those who've pretty much gone through high school math. It's not that problematic, and I like thinking that most people can go, oh, okay, well that's how you work with an equation and with reciprocals, and Marx is about ratios. The Marxist math in its more higher form was essentially a note taking on calculus. He was trying to teach himself, just like he was trying to teach himself Russian. So, didn't use, even in his 60s, Marx was sort of trying to fiddle around, figure this stuff out. Noting, of course, that the later Marx was interested not only in Russian, but in a variety of other activities, which I think is a good suggestion for all of us. That is, looking at natural science and geology and stuff like that in our later years could be actually kind of interesting as a process. So, Simon Clarke's summary of Capital Volume 3, subtitled The Process of Capitalist Production as a Whole. That is, as looking at the totality of it, concerned primarily with the internal differentiation. And this idea of differentiation is also both the literal and the figurative. That is, it can actually be thought of in a mathematical way as well, even though difference, I think, goes in a very different direction from those of us who follow on other theoretical humanist matters. The first 3 parts are concerned with, of volume 3, are concerned with the division of surplus value amongst individual capitals where it takes the form of profit. And this is this general idea that by the end of reading all 3 volumes, you get this sense of, well, it's land, labor, and capital. And Marx has focused, of course, on capital because that's kind of more controversial in some ways because it's a little more abstract. It's not the ground, and it ain't us pumping iron. So it's this other thing, which is a little more abstract and needs to be sort of worked through. You need to work it through because it's constantly at work at you anyway. If you own a credit card, I mean, capital is working on you. So knowing more about it is, unless you're a criminal type or have made some clear decisions about doing everything in cash, it's going to touch your life. The following parts are concerned with merchant's capital, interest-bearing capital, and landed capital. The last part draws the whole account together. The aim of the volume as a whole is to locate and describe the concrete forms which grow out of the movements of capital as a whole. Remember, in volume 2, we're looking at the movement question about that it's, it flows. There's a stock and flow model for what capital is, and it is problematic because, it's how people have made money and how growth occurred and how people took advantage of other people. The various forms of capital is evolved in this book, thus approach step by step the form which they assume on the surface of society in the action of different capitals on one another in competition. See, Marx isn't against competition. He knows this stuff goes on. It's just that, we can see how some people take advantage of other people due to a variety of ways in which you kind of conceal what you're doing. That is, engage in a kind of asymmetric information. And lest you think that's unimportant, when you buy a car, it's always at work. Worse if you're buying something used. So that's the whole point of asymmetric information, or lemons, as some people refer to. And in the ordinary consciousness of the agents of production themselves. So that's operative everywhere. Now, I put in this little section here that you don't have to read. I hope that you can read it and that you get this sense that if you're going to look at total value, it is a combination of surplus value, variable capital, and constant capital. CVS, not unlike the drugstore. It is, of course, the constant capital, buildings, land, etc., with variable capital, that is cash, money, commodities, etc. And then S, which is the surplus value, the stuff that's either skimmed off of your labor or something that stands for your labor. And that's sort of important for you to remind yourself, paths not taken are also costs. That is, if you don't do something, there are costs of not doing something. And standard economics, you can refer to that as kind of opportunities. And those, Marx is kind of thinking about that. He doesn't use that term, but it's a fairly standard idea. That is, what is the cost of not doing something? And unless you think that's unimportant, the fact that we have airplanes flying around with not running full, although the optimum situation is to run with a full airplane. That is, every seat is taken, regardless of how it's being paid for. It's better to run with full planes. But if you have a less than full plane, there are reasons to actually have the damn thing up in the air for a variety of programming or network reasons. That is, you're going to need to have a plane in some place the next day because you've already scheduled to have that plane there the next day. So you got to put the damn thing up in the air. And how you recover costs? Well, I won't go at great length about this, but you can carry other things like freight, whatever, and that helps cover costs. So anyway, opportunity costs, a very simple example worth looking up for your own reasons why it's better to do something than not do something. That there are costs for not doing something. And so even when you get down to this little equation 2 thing here, it is pretty much this issue of, V over V is 1 and 1 plus C over V underneath S over V. You can reconcile that fairly quickly. And it is about ratios. CV is the ratio of constant capital, variable capital, and is called the organic composition of capital, which is, lends those of us who prefer jokes to, what's the inorganic composition of capital, blah, 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 because we're being John Hayes-like. But capital labor ratios are actually kind of important because they tell us a little bit something about how many people it takes to do one thing, sorta, but then not. because it's not as easily worked through as I think you could imagine, particularly with um, more higher technology, advanced technology. Anyway, so that's from a separate page on Marx's theory of capitalist development economics. That it is a kind of important. It's what Paul Sweezy spent a significant amount of time reading, and not a lot of people read it enough. I would say in the literature, and I think it's actually important to go back to it to sort of. I mean, it's written in the 40s and gives you a good sense that, oh well, yeah, there was kind of, we normally think of Harvard as being one thing, but it's got a lot of things going on in it. Anyway, chapter 1, finally, chapter 1, volume 3 of Marx's Capital, summary by Simon Clarke. This chapter introduces the notion of cost price. This is not a standard term, and you don't need to worry too much about it, but it is an idea. The actual production cost of a commodity is C plus V plus S, the amount of labor time embodied in it. This is the congealment sort of thing. However, and this is why congealment is a problem. However, the capitalist does not pay for S. Thus, the cost appears to the capitalist as C plus V equals K. That is the cost price, the cost before surplus value. The cost price, the expenditure of capital, while the actual cost is measured by the expenditure of labor. So, you can imagine that, right? That the ratio of labor to capital is still an important thing, and you can sort of imagine, well, the capitalists always get something out of this. They wouldn't hire you if they didn't get something out of it, right? And similarly, you get things out of it, but sometimes you don't get the same damn thing and as much. The category of cost price has nothing to do with the formation of value. This is before you sort of work through the value thing. And value, of course, like surplus value, as one example, is this larger abstract entity that is referred to in a variety of ways and which confuses some people because of the idea of abstract labor and a variety of other things, but it's still about value, this larger sort of category. And you need to be flexible about thinking about it, because you could measure value, but because it has all these variables, it's a little more difficult. And as I've said before, we have advanced technology. We can start to begin to measure value more directly. It's just that we don't, it's not in the statistics, which it actually should be. Thus, an increase in the cost price that arises out of an increase in wages should not have any effect on the value created, but only on the division of that value between capitalist and worker. So wages are, one way of looking at it, but it's interesting that the labor unions actually try and work through this, and they have worked through this, and usually you have an economist in a union, if you're a big union, to work through some of those issues. Which you use whenever the contract comes up. You can actually sort of work through the numbers, and you could use it as a way in which you argue, make a fight with management. However, for the capitalists, there's no apparent difference between labor power and means of production as cost. Everything seems the same. You are replaceable as any nut, bolt, or wrench in one sense. The capitalist does not distinguish between constant and variable capital. Thus, for the capitalist, the surplus value produced seems to not derive from the variable component of capital, but from the whole capital advance, and it seems a little pejorative, but in fact, that's kind of what happened at the front end of the 19th century sort of industry. You look at, how many workers is this going to be worth, and blah, blah, blah. And then the capitalist starts thinking, man, they're just more unreliable. I need a machine to replace some of these folks in order to do a better job, make more profit. As such, the surplus value appears in the converted form of profit on capital. Thus, the value appears as cost price plus profit. So profit is a way of thinking about surplus value, but, it's a little contingent. The profit is thus the same as surplus value, only in a mystified form that is nevertheless a necessary outgrowth of the capitalist mode of production. Because at one pole, and you want to think of this as a continuum, at one pole, the price of labor power assumes the transmuted form of wages. Surplus value appears at the opposite pole in the transmuted form of profit. So, you see this ratio relation. But as I've said before, when you look at your paycheck, there's all kinds of other things going on, and you need to sort of get a sense of where all these things are moving around. And often it works in your favor, In other ways, it works not in your favor for a variety of reasons. And then there are even other things beyond that, your credit rating or whatever. This chapter introduces the concept of the rate of profit. Remember, we're talking about ratios and certain a ratio over time, which creates this kind of way of thinking about stuff. The capitalist relates his profit not to the advanced variable capital. Remember, advanced variable capital, when we were looking at it in the last volume, was this fourth circuit. And it was advanced because there's just more other stuff. So the capitalist relates his profit not to the advanced variable capital, but to the total capital advance, the whole thing, the whole enchilada. And this measures the extent of his gain. The rate of profit is therefore different from the rate of exploitation, S over V. It is S over C plus V. That is, it's thinking about, value plus capital over the surplus. Thus, the profit produced appears not as a form of surplus labor, but it's the product of capital itself. So it's just already in there. You sort of don't want to describe it too much if you're a capitalist, because it's just easier for the worker to figure out how much they're worth in that particular context. Moreover, because the capitalist can increase his profits by selling his commodity above its value, it appears that the profit derives as much from the ability of the capitalist to exploit market possibilities as on his ability to exploit his workers. Whereas, in fact, of course, if the capitalist sells his product above its value to another capitalist, he's simply diverting surplus value from the other capitalist to himself. And if you want to deal with this in capitalist terms, this is the issue of so-called business-to-business calculation, B2B. Thus, we have another form of fetishism, yay, in which the relationships of capital are obscured by the fact that all parts of capital appear equally as the source of excess value profit. But it isn't, of course. If you just imagine, if you're selling to other capitalists as opposed to the market, you're going to see some differences. And that's kind of what Marx is about. He sees all this other stuff going on. He wants to account for it, whether it's, corruption, criminality at all levels, all that kind of stuff is going on. And then you get the state sort of stepping in and sort of cleaving off other things. And then you have idiots like Trump saying, oh, well, we're gonna have a 100% tariff on all foreign goods. And it's just like, what a fuckhead. But anyway, chapter 3. In this chapter, Marx examines at considerable length the relationship between the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value, noting, of course, that no one measures rates of surplus value on the capitalist side, right? Why should we tell them how much we're stealing from them? Anyway, the rate of profit is always smaller than the rate of surplus value. In fact, the extent to which it differs from the rate of surplus value is indicated by the value composition of capital. That is, that you probably have more, and some people refer to them as sunk costs. The machines cost a whole fuckload more. I mean, if you have a CNC rather than, 10 lathes and, a milling machine, it's just, there's differences and not quite the same as a value in other ways. And don't worry about this little equation here. I didn't put it in the way it should appear. It's all jumbled up. But anyway, I'll fix that. Hence, with a given rate of exploitation, the higher the organic composition, the lower the rate of profit. Chapter 4, you see, we've just moved right along. Although there are 50 chapters, so it's like a little nuts. The chapters are very short, so don't make yourself crazy by thinking, oh God, there are 50 of these idiot things. The more rapidly capital turns over, that is, the shorter the turnover time. Remember, we introduced that idea in the last volume. The higher the rate of profit. So it is measured by, going through this cycle or circuit. And Marx is trying to, he's not the inventor of the idea of circuits of capital, but he's trying to use it in a way that makes it intelligible, to his primary audience, that is working class folks. The idea of the workers can figure out, oh, well, that's why I'm being worked to death, or my children are being worked to death, etc. You see why that is important. But Marx generally leaves turnover time out of account in this volume. Now, why does he do that? Well, I think the idea of doing it is to sort of know that it's there, but I think he, like what he does in volumes 1 and 2, he sort of puts this off because, I'm going to account for this later on. And some of it is a measurement problem. That is, without getting too absurd, if Marx had better understanding of the difference, the so-called Charles Babbage difference engine, he might have been able to calculate turnover time, but he didn't. And so he, and that would be an interesting counterfactual in and of itself to the Babbage difference engine. Marx discovers the difference engine. Anyway, chapter 5, because the rate of profit depends on the composition of capital as well as the rate of exploitation. It can be increased by economy in the use of constant capital. That's what I was just saying about the CNC versus 10 lathes or whatever. Thus, capitalists try to save on plant and buildings to reduce wastage of raw material and to invent cheaper machinery. And unless you think that's unimportant, I know far too many people who go to Harbor Freight to buy their, machinery, and the machinery is usually made in China, which does not make it bad machinery, but it is cheaper to reduce wastage of raw material and invent cheaper machinery. The economy is at the expense of the working conditions of the working class. It just you can defer some elements as they receive inadequate protection from the elements. Workplaces are overcrowded and machinery is run at dangerously high rates. Well, if I run this machinery twice as fast, and maybe, I'll run through a few more workers, but I can replace them. There's it's a kind of fluid labor market. Maybe I can get some kids to do this, or women to do this, whatever. Chapter 6, the rate of profit can be also increased by cheapening raw materials, especially through foreign trade, by cheapening the workers' means of consumption, and so labor power, and by accelerating the depreciation of machinery. Unless you think that's not important, if this is the question of, the darn Chinese, they're dumping cheaper steel on the market, and blah, 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 blah. I'd love to have Biden ask Trump about, well, what proportion of your buildings are made with Chinese steel? Just ask him that just to fuck with him in a debate. Anyway, chapter 7. We can therefore see that there's a whole series of different factors that can affect the rate of profit quite independently of the rate of exploitation through their effect on the value composition of capital or on its turnover time. So you have more variables again. Remember, none of these factors affect the total profit, that is the total surplus value produced, partially because it's, you're trying to generalize these things. It's an abstraction and has various components, but it's kind of hard to sort of figure out. But they all serve to alter the size of the capital to which it's related. So there's still this thing you got to measure it again. Thus, the capitalist sees that his rate of profit depends on a whole series of factors that are quite independent of his ability to produce surplus value in the immediate process of production. So if you're talking about, sort of statistical stuff or math stuff, variables are not all identical. They have different elements that weight them, that is, that have different emphases. And some are more intermediate than others. Some are more or less causal than others. So if you're trying to think of, you're trying to run a business, not all variables are identical, and they don't have the same kind of, power as or effect. Chapter 8, you see, we've already moved quite far along. From now on, Marx assumes that the rate of exploitation is the same in all departments. Note that Marx is trying to make it easy for himself to, do the basic math that will hopefully make it understandable to people looking at the front end. This is obviously a simplifying assumption. It's not realistic. So this is where even capitalist economics or orthodox economics is problematic, because you always have to hold certain things constant in order to just sort of get the idea, and particularly if you're teaching it. It depends on an approximate equalization of wage levels. Everybody makes the same. The seniority doesn't count. Intensity of labor, having kids work the machines rather than people who've been there for a while. And length of the working day between industries. Not everything is identical in terms of working day for X number of reasons. Given this assumption, the rate of profit on a particular capital, so long as everything exchanges at its value, remember we're talking about abstractions again, will depend on the organic composition of capital. That is, how many machines you have and how the quality and blah, 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 and the turnover time of that capital. So we're looking at the variables again. You have constant or fixed capital, and then you have more variables that affect turnover time, labor, for example, among many things, the labor version of capital, the lower will be the rate of profit because the less will be the portion of the capital, i.e. variable capital, I just said, in the productive phase that is actually producing surplus value. However, there is no doubt that differences in the rate of profit in the various branches of industry do not exist in reality and could not exist without abolishing the entire system of capitalist production. And well, that's a little overstating it, but there is a difference, and that's kind of why we have globalization. You get a cheaper labor in an entire nation because the entire nation works for cheaper. It's going to affect the market. It would seem, therefore, that here the theory of value is incompatible with the real phenomena of production, and that for this reason, any attempt to understand these phenomena should be given up. I mean, and in some ways, that's what you're confronted with. If you're running a company and some asshole across the border is undercutting you because of various reasons, and they actually produce a shittier product, then you have to start working on how am I going to beat this competitor, whatever. It's no different for people making very small products that are not very complicated to those who are making electric cars, for example. It would seem, therefore, that here the theory of value is incompatible, etc. If commodities exchange their values, then the rate of profit in different industries must be therefore different. If the rate of profit is to be equalized, as in practice it is in capitalist society, this is an assumption that Marx is making in order just to get his numbers to work, then commodities cannot exchange their values. It seems that the labor theory of value that underlies Marx's whole account has become unstuck at last. To try and reconcile the theory with reality, Marx turns to the concept of cost price. This is estimating everything before surplus value, and argues that we have to understand the equalization of the rate of profit in terms of the competition between capitals on the basis of cost price. So this is a little, another assumption that it's not a bad assumption. It's just that it just forces you to sort of say, oh, okay, well, I'm just going to work the average here. And now I have to go through a whole nother set of calculations in order to work out how exploitation works. And this is the problem that Roman was sort of looking at, is that labor theory of value assumes that you're not going to work, you're shortcutting your own work by trying to hold the surplus value sort of separate. Chapter 9. Marx continues to assume a constant rate of exploitation and now abstracts from differences in turnover time. So Marx is being systematic. He's looking at, okay, well, I'm going to hold this one variable constant, and now I'm going to hold this other variable sort of more constant, whatever that means. The rate of profit on a particular capital, therefore, depends on the organic composition of that capital, so long as commodities exchange at their values. If we take all the capitals together, we can work out an average rate of profit, that is, the total surplus value over total capital advanced. So Marx is trying to get to a point where, as I was saying, now that we have computers, we could actually calculate this. In the 19th century, it's going to be hard. If each individual capital is to earn the average rate of profit, then prices must diverge from values. That is, where price is not the same as value. In those branches with an above average organic composition, the price will be higher than the value, so raising the rate of profit. In branches with below average organic composition, the price will be lower than value, so depressing the rate of profit. So there's some effect on the so-called rate of profit. Thus, the price of the commodity, once it gets to the market, will be equal to the cost price plus an amount of profit calculated on the initial capital at the average rate. What's the capitalist going to get out of this? If the constant capital is all used up in one period, then the initial capital is the cost price, and the final price, the price of production, is equal to C plus V times 1 plus R, which is the profit rate, where R is the rate of profit. Marx's example is rather more complicated than this because he also allows different turnover times, so that the cost price, i.e. the constant capital used up in producing the commodity plus the variable capital employed, does not equal the initial capital outlay, since only a part of the total constant capital is used up. It's already made it hard for himself. It is the competition between capitals, various constant capitals of one type or another, bigger, smaller machines, et cetera, that ensures that an equalization of the rate of profit, that is, capitals will move out of industries with a low rate of profit into industries with a high rate of profit until prices diverge sufficiently from values to equalize the rate of profit. Now, whether that happens in reality is a whole different question. Marx insists that, although prices diverge from values, the prices can only be calculated on the basis of values. This is an insistence that can be problematic when you've already said, well, values are kind of abstract. You can't it's difficult to measure them, particularly with the relationship of fixed capital to variable capital, or circulating capital, that is, I'm sorry, or constant and variable capital, that is. They cannot be directly calculated as cost price versus average profit. So bypassing the labor theory of value, because to perform this calculation, it is necessary to know what the average rate of profit is, and this can only be calculated in value terms, which is what I just said, as the total surplus value divided by the total capital. Thus, although prices of production diverge from values, Marx argues they are transformed forms of value. All that happens is that the process of competition redistributes surplus value amongst the capitals, some getting more surplus value than they have themselves produced, that is, prices above value, and others less, that is, prices below value. This redistribution does not, for Marx, affect the total surplus value, nor, since it is simply a market phenomenon, a phenomenon of circulation, does it affect the analysis of capitalist production that was conducted in value terms. Capitalists still seek to, they're still motivated to seek the increase the surplus value they can produce by all means at their disposal, even though they will ultimately have to share the increase with others, just as they have to do when they introduce an innovation that will eventually reduce prices. Now, whether you could or couldn't really do that is problematic, and it depends on other kinds of things. So let's say you've invented a piece of technology or software that improves the price of your object, or you've increased your prices, but you've made it palatable to the market because your software is so good that, that advantage is going to outweigh all the other things. So you roll a whole bunch of things out there, and the thing screws up, and people crash their Max 737 airplanes, and everything fucks up, and then you've got to stop making these damn things, even though you have a commitment to 25 airplanes here, airplanes here, and 50 airplanes there, and blah, 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 blah. And so you're all fucked up on the delivery of all these things. But since the market is highly variable, and the people don't necessarily buy the planes, but rather you sort of buy this sort of a promise of the plane itself. And then in some ways you have this intermediate firm that leases them to the airlines, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's all more mucked up. You don't have such a big problem. So Boeing is not in a big trouble. I mean, they have a PR problem, but it's not like Airbus is going to leap in and grab all the contracts, although at a certain moment in the market system, they will probably. And at another level of the system, although they've been very smart about it, the Chinese with their new CJ or J, whatever the hell it is, regional jet, will actually step in as well. And the advantage in the Chinese case is they build everything in-house, that is within the borders of China, because they're essentially building, because they built it before on license, a Airbus 319 or 320 or whatever the hell it is. Marx's development of this argument is not terribly clear. That's what I'm trying to suggest, is he puts it in terms of the argument that the sum of the prices of production of all commodities produced in society is equal to the sum of their values, which, is going to confuse Marxists for decades. The divergences of price from value compensate one another. Now, the presumption here, of course, is that the math is nice and easy. The easiest way to see this is remember that circulation cannot create value or surplus value. Thus, the divergence of prices from value can only redistribute an existing quantity of value. It doesn't make new value. So that gains and losses all balance out. Marx assumed that the transformation of values into prices of production did not affect the magnitude of surplus value, but only its distribution amongst the various capitals. Marx is not assuming that you can invent capital elsewhere, which is, in fact, the problem of fictitious capital. This is to assume that the transformation does not affect the rate of exploitation, since we know that the total sum of value cannot change. If, however, the industries producing workers' means of compensation have a below average organic composition of capital, the price of those means of consumption falls. So there's some effect on workers. It'll just happen at some moment. This will only leave the rate of exploitation unchanged if wages fall to compensate for this. In other words, the total wage bill is unaffected by these things. Thus, the transformation of values into prices also involves the transformation of the wage. So, sort of ipso facto, whatever. The transformation of values into prices affects not only the prices that individual capitalists receive for their commodities, but also prices they pay for labor power and other means of production. Thus, the total effect of the transformation is very complex. Working out the precise effect is the so-called transformation problem. And there are decades spent on this fucking problem. Marx did not in fact do this, and it's quite a complex mathematical exercise. Much ink has been spilled over this. However, and this is Simon Clarke commenting, it can be shown that it's possible to derive a set of prices of production consistent with an equal rate of profit from the set of values. How does the transformation of values into prices affect the analysis that Marx has so far carried out in terms of values? Marx argues that the effect of the transformation is that a capitalist no longer receives an amount of profit corresponding to the amount of surplus value he produces. Thus, the capitalist is producing surplus value not directly for himself, but for all the capitalists. How altruistic. Thus, the mass of surplus value produced in a particular sphere of production is then more important for the average profit of social capital, by extension, and thus for the capitalist class in general than for the individual capitalist in any specific branch of production. It is of importance to the latter only insofar as the quantity of surplus value produced in his or her branch helps to regulate the average profit. But this is a process which occurs behind his back, one he does not see nor understand, and indeed which does not interest him. So there's a lot of assumptions here. The actual difference of magnitude between profit and surplus value now completely conceals the true nature and origin of profit, not only from the capitalist, but from the labor. In other words, the laborer was mystified at the front end because they didn't know where the hell their wages, was going on with the wages that was making surplus value. And this is the argument you have in labor negotiations. But now the capitalist doesn't kind of know what's going on, and in some ways the evil can be occurred because, well, I use the stuff we made to, buy back stock or whatever. Thus, profit appears to derive not from the labor of the worker, but from capital itself. Thus, the fact that surplus value appears in the converted form of profit completes the fetishism, the category. Note what we're fetishizing here are categories and abstract notions as bodies of thinking about capital by concealing the source of profit. On the other hand, the category of value continues to regulate the capitalist mode of production in two senses. So there's still an effect. It's not like it's all going on and we don't have to care about it. You have to really care about it. It continues to apply to the level of capital in general. The laws already discussed are, as Marx will put it, are the laws of the general rate of profit. In other words, he's looking for a kind of universal here, a generalization that it can apply to larger groups of things, that is, groups of capitalists and their firms or markets and, whatever. Number two, it continues to apply to the individual capitalist to the extent that he or she is able to retain the advantages he gains by increasing the rate of exploitation. In other words, he or she knows this is going on. So how am I going to keep my exploitation rate up, whatever, particularly for X number of reasons. This is kind of the entry point where we get the Romer's stuff that under socialism you can still exploit things or people. Thus, in the short term, and remember, it's always short term, long term, and one needs to be very careful with how one phrases this kind of argument and certain critiques using a kind of Marxian model. In the short term, the individual capitalist can increase his rate of profit by means of all the methods already discussed. That is, lengthening the working day, increasing productivity, increasing the intensity of labor, economizing on the means of production and subsistence, reducing the turnover time of its capital. So already you have a bunch of things that are all, on your spreadsheet. But in the longer term, competition will erode his extra profits and so distribute the gains amongst the capitalist class. So you have this turnover problem. And lest you think that's unimportant, this is the whole problem of the housing market. Housing market has all these kind of lags on turnover, economizing on construction, increasing worker productivity, hiring scab labor, immigrants, for example. All those things are at work. Thus, and I haven't even mentioned the financing problem, which is Trump. Thus, the transformation of values into prices affects the distribution of surplus value among the individual capitalists, but it does not affect the underlying dynamic of capitalist production. It takes a whole bunch of work to try and fuck up an economy, but we managed to do it. And we've done this, in our lifetime, certainly several times over. Finally, chapter 10. Well, finally, this chapter develops the argument of the previous one by examining the actual mechanism of equalization. It's sort of a fake argument in the sense that at one moment is anything equalized, but this is an equilibrium argument that Marx doesn't quite get to. He's trying to get there, but with calculus he probably would have gotten there. Marx points out that what is involved is a tendency of all capitals to achieve the average rate of profit. What is at issue is how this comes about. This must be something that takes place, that exchange does this, right? It must be the market. The whole difficulty arises from the fact that commodities are not exchanged simply as commodities, but as products of capital. So he's already kind of confusing what's going on. Thus, it involves a modification of the laws of commodity exchange discussed in Volume 1, Chapter 1, which were only appropriate to simple commodity production. Where advanced commodity production is a lot more complicated. And thus, Marx argues, are appropriate to a pre-capitalist stage of production. This is an argument that many disagree with, claiming that commodities have never in practice exchanged at their value, since there has never been such a thing as a non-capitalist form of developed commodity production. It's an interesting kind of question, and you can use it to argue all kinds of wacky things. You could even use this to argue that communism doesn't work because whatever, and it's a stupid argument anyway. Of course, even in such circumstances, the market price could diverge from the value of the commodity. But in this case, the divergences even out. Thus, the pattern of market prices, and equally of prices of production, is dominated by movements of value. So it's, again, a little slippery, and maybe you could get this to work for other reasons. This is achieved as a result of the process of competition. And you can read this in a variety of ways. And in one sense, this is where Hayek and von Mises sort of pounce on the argument. And therefore, dim-witted theoreticians of capitalism, try and leap on it. Thus, competition between capitalists in the same branch of production produces a single social value as a result of the equalization of the various individual values, i.e., the value is regulated by the socially necessary labor time and not the individual labor time. You can see how ugly this can get, right? There is this averaging about, what counts as socially necessary because it's engaged in your subsistence and a whole bunch of other things. And it sort of is connected to what you as a laborer are doing. And so there's a kind of confusion of scale at that level. Supply and demand can lead the market price to fluctuate around the social value, but it is the value that determines the center of these fluctuations. So he's trying to simplify this and get us to work. An increase in demand means that commodities produced under less favorable conditions must be able to enter the market. So the market price rises and vice versa. You can skip the lengthy discussion of supply and demand if you like. He's trying to work through this. He's trying to say, well, maybe the market kind of is powerful enough to get this to work out. And it's a math problem in that sense. The overall effect of competition, however, is to press market prices towards the market value, according to the socially necessary labor time. When we turn to the capitalist market, we find that we're no longer dealing with a simple purchase and sale of commodities. It is not simply a matter of converting the value of the commodity into the money form that is price, because it's not simple commodity producers, but capitalists who meet in the market. Okay, make this simple. There's a prediction that in 2 years, we're going to have a glut in oil. It's not a glut in oil. It just means that relative to the relative supply of oil. There will be more because we've got electric cars, we've had a couple of wars, there's other manufacturing problems, there's bottlenecks in the market for X number of reasons. The Saudi owned the natural gas facility in the U.S., and why they do is beyond me. But anyway, you have all these market conditions that will allow the price of oil to stay low, in effect. Now, what should I be doing? Should I assume that, well, the price is going to go down, so therefore I don't need to buy an electric car in the next couple of years. I can sort of keep my internal combustion engine, my fossil fuel engine for a little while longer because the prices will remain relatively low. Well, the reality, of course, it's not necessarily reality because other things could happen, and we've already had a inelastic price where the current cost of gas for me is somewhere around $3 and plus change, and in California it's even worse. And technically, if we had a clean market, I should be, we're back into the $2 range. And so therefore, every time I fill up the tank, I'm going, why the fuck is the price so high? And it affects me worse because, well, I've got to get gas for my lawnmower, and yes, I can't afford an electric lawnmower, and blah 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 blah. And so, but it's still cheaper for me to fill my jerry can full of gas from the pump without blowing myself up, rather than going to the hardware store where a single gallon of unleaded gasoline for lawnmowers, because it doesn't have all those stupid additives that you have to add stabilizer for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is $40 a gallon, or whatever. It's $40 a can, whatever it is. It's really fucking expensive. So anyway, that was my little aside, and I've almost used up my time. We have a few more minutes, and let me see how much we have here. Oh shit, it's gonna be another day. Damn it. So I'm going to finish this up on volume 3 tomorrow. I hope you've understood what I've fiddled around with so far, because I was trying to put in reasonable, understandable examples that actually explain what the Marxist problem is and has always been, and that some Marxists have spent decades working through arguments. The argument is therefore not always clear. It is incomplete and sometimes rather rambling. Don't be intimidated by this. Really, don't be intimidated by it. There's a lot of ink being spilled, and some Marxists spent decades spilling ink, and with really serious math. There's a guy, Morishima, who was at Cambridge, and he's got great equations, and the thing works, but to what end was a whole nother set of questions, and a whole bunch of other things were involved. But this was before computers, so it's even worse. So anyway, I think I'm going to stop soon. Let me capital is not a thing but a social relation. It's always been not a thing and is always a social relation. You should always kind of remember that. We're going to get up to chapter 50 and 52, which raises certain questions by the end. And the questions we will ask are, how does the Trinity formula, that is capital, land, and labor, underlie the cost of production theory of price? And it's actually an important question. You need to sort of, how are all these things related, which is what I was talking about today at the front end. That is, production is still important. Land, labor, and capital are still part of the problem, and you can't sort of subtract one. So that's kind of the answer, sort of. Number 2, how does Marx's critique of the Trinity formula enable us to complete his unfinished chapter on social classes? This is where the socially necessary labor form and the idea of social capital actually are kind of related, and is still a current problem, because in the Chinese case, you have social credit, which would have an effect on these matters as well. If social classes are not defined by a common revenue, how are they defined? And this common revenue issue obviously is related to trade as well, among other things. What are the implications? And number 4, what are the implications of the understanding of the concept of class of Marx's discussion of production relations and distribution relations. So this creates other issues for analysis, but Marx kind of, he sort of knows this is still happening, and he tries to, tell us that in history, these things still happen, and they happen in sufficiently generalizable forms that we can talk about class struggle still at the end. But it is, of course, made more complicated by, as I've said before, the math partially, and because some people just spent far too much time on them, and that the tech of our analysis, and also certain theoretical issues, that is, trying to work through a kind of algorithmic relation that helps us have computers do it, is the kind of advance that is really important for us. And also questions of capitalists. I mean, you don't want to admit, to the workers how much you're ripping them off. I mean, who would? Yeah. I mean, what would the workers do with that information? That's a rhetorical question, needless to say. So I've added something from a different page on a graphical illustration of Marxist model of development, and it has a whole bunch of variables on it and all kinds of stuff. You don't have to read it unless you're really into the math, and I didn't fix some of the things, so I have to go back in and fix it. But it's just as a matter of teaching, it's to show you that those little graphs that you normally get taught in the undergraduate economics course actually still are there. The basic empirical point that is never made for undergraduates, except in the advanced classes, is that all of these are mathematical relationships. That is, these lines and shit are not just lines; they're equations everywhere. And you need to sort of work through why that is, and that these graphic examples do not necessarily behave as reality does. So this is already an abstraction, and you can see little effects here. But when you get to trying to figure out, well, this triangle means this, and this means that, and then they start to overlap, and it just gets ugly and stupid. And you can't do the math because the professor was too lazy to figure this out at the equation and data level to actually, give you a little example that you could go to the web page, you could plug in some of the numbers and see, oh, well, that's how that works. It is still the failure, and from a pedagogical point of view, to take these basic models. And in fact, you could take out the word Marx and still do this as a labor market thing. Marx would have nothing to do with it. You just do it, and there wouldn't be any ideology involved. That's in fact the beauty of Marx moving towards more scientific ends, and that is that Marx would never, he'd just be this. Oh well, Marx had this idea about this particular relationship of savings, investment, and labor and money. And that's kind of how it works, and it's sort of an interesting side example of a much larger set of stuff that was done by a bunch of other economists. And there's no real division, in effect, between certain elements of neoclassical and a proto-neoclassical version that's being done by this guy, this German guy, who he wasn't a mathematician, but a couple of people after him sort of worked through the implications of this. And so if you make this adjustment, that's kind of what happens. And it's really unfortunate. So this little paragraph here is what is another way of talking about the same problem. And so I've included, don't worry about these little math things. They're the same. They're just showing you how you can actually calculate the little trope of, for example, the organic composition of capital. And it's a ratio of constant and variable capital over or under the total capital. It's not that hard. Don't make yourself crazy. But there is a PowerPoint that actually can explain all that if the math comes easy to you. I included a video on the specific mathematical manuscripts of Karl Marx. Whether it's good or not is up to you. I've included because I wanted to show that there are people out there trying to work through this and make it intelligible such that maybe someday, it's not going to be so taboo to talk about Marx in the standard business school. Now I know that in the British context, that's not such a controversial thing, but if you do this in the United States, for the most part, because of anti-communism from the Cold War, it's about cooties. So that's the problem. Okay, so I included that plus another slide thing, the links to Higginbotham's lectures 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is 4. And it's got all the stuff that you want that we've just been talking about: turnover, valorization, blah, 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 blah. It's all there. It's just all there. It's not that hard. It should be, at some moment you should be able to go over and go, oh, okay, well, this is because if you're not talking about this, then you got to talk about turnover time or blah, 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 and just make it, it's not so hard, Anyway, so I like to think that we're keeping up with the same general pattern here of that the Stalinist, a tanky, created a schedule that you would cover all of capital in 1 year. We've covered it all even less time because we've only been looking at the summaries. But if you were actually doing the reading, this is at about 10 to 15 pages a day. You could probably get to the end at the end of the year. And then I put in the links to the lectures of David Harvey on volume 2. He skips the same kinds of things. This is not, classes 1 through 12 gets you to the end of volume 2, but, he skips over stuff because it's just, as we've said above in the summary, don't have to read it. This is one thing that just bogs you down. And if you try and say, well, why the hell did he put this in here? You have to say, oh, okay, well, that's in for a certain amount of clarity, but it really is unnecessary to read simply because you don't need to read it. It's redundant in some ways. And also because it's bad editing. And, you want to argue against not only Engels, but a whole bunch of Russians or Germans who've been annoying about that. Now, I close at the end because I'm at the end of my time with a 1989, which I mentioned yesterday, The Sublime Object of Ideology. And it's a 1989 text, and it has several chapters, and it's available. I may upload a copy of it. I have a copy of it, I think, somewhere. And it's a little more, it has some typos in it. Reasons why it's all still important to read this stuff, why it is still important to include, and it makes intelligible all that ink spilled for post-structural models of how psychoanalysis or psychology overlaps and integrates with the Marxian model, and it is intelligible, and I would assert that it is. It's just that a lot of people spilled ink because they didn't want to do the math, but they're perfectly willing to make the psychology or the subjectivity more complicated, simply because people don't sort of understand a bunch of things, and they should have, figured it out as undergraduates. But anyway, and so I think it's still worth looking at. And as I've said before, the science of logic, that is Hegel's logic, is still important to this day, and it is why some people still are studying it, because it doesn't get as much attention for a variety of reasons, including math. And more people focus on the phenomenology, the phenomenology of spirit of Hegel, etc. And then in terms of making this relatable, and this particular little thing relatable, I think you could say that this is similar to the issue that we saw in our videos that we were looking at in terms of people shaving metal off of coins in the 18th century or 17th century. Well, actually, the 18th century is the Yorkshire sort of activity. So that's what's there. And so now the reason why that's important, that is mentioning Yorkshire, coin shaving and production, is because this activity is occurring not at a production level, that is at the level of factories or whatever. It is happening at the level of exchange. All this coin shaving is a way in which you can talk about a productive activity within the context of modes of exchange. So this doesn't make more ink spilling necessary, but it is important to understand that exchange is what's going on there in the context of shaving metal off of coins, and or the shaving you see is only symptomatic of a whole system of other productive activities. That is, getting cheaper metal and employing it in making new coins, in recoining things, because the production processes by that time have allowed us to make coin dies that it doesn't, it's the same die. It's the same, you've taken an impression from the original coin. And so if you make cheaper metal, you can, stamp out a different version in, slug metal of one kind, and therefore skim the profit off. So in effect, you have a sub industry that is not based in the kind of thing that only the government should be doing, that is minting money, but you've created a small sub production that is cheating or corrupting the entire system. And lest you think that's unimportant, the Iranians, before we started putting more security features in our $100 bills, made a sizable amount of capital building from really good counterfeit $100 bills. The Iranians were like, oh, well, we can just use this medieval model of, flooding the market with American cash or paying with counterfeit bills, and fuck them. And, it's pretty much what they were doing. So it is the reason why we have people, playing around with pallets of cash. And particularly the new ones, which have, all these other things that are kind of difficult to make. You have ink that has metal in it, metallic stuff in it. You have stuff that can only be read by certain types of optical scanners. You have the pattern itself that needs to be made more complicated. You have multiple impressions, which necessitate a much more complicated production process, and yet you still have idiots out there trying to make these things with inkjet printers. So anyway, that's enough for me talking. I think you can talk now. Is there anyone who wants to talk? Does anyone have any questions?
Well,
we're ahead of where we should be reading. I'm doing this volume 3 overview to give you a sense that there is an ending. that it's not so problematic. It just means that we have to be a little more open to some of the complications, not get distracted by people who have fetishized certain ideological positions, and with whom you can have fights with, but ultimately it's still about overthrowing capitalism and blah blah blah.
And I had a little quick comment about counterfeiting.
Yes,
there was a guy in his early 20s up in Canada that, I'm not sure if he was using an inkjet or what, but he was making some pretty reasonable facsimiles, and then he found, through an art supply store, he found a green ink that had metallic particles in it. And bingo, he was able to sell this stuff to the Canadian mob or whatever for 40 cents on the dollar. And
that's a good profit.
He was making a pretty good bundle there. But he started spending in a way that attracted attention, new cars and new this and new that and everything.
Therefore, an idiot.
Yeah. Early 20s,
Hey.
So, yeah, he got nailed. But I thought it was pretty cool that he had actually pulled it off for a while before he got caught.
I think anyone can, if you can get those things that are really difficult. Remember, it's not paper; it's fabric.
Yeah, and it's got little tiny red fibers and different colored fibers.
It's got shit like that in it. It's really a fairly complicated object. Not as wonderful or beautiful or multicolored as other monies. I mean, the Dutch money is beautiful money. It's got, lots of colors and mixing and all kinds of
Oh,
really
yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
But and American money isn't quite that, but at least it has more colors now, which is nice. Didn't used to have all those colors.
But speaking of pallets of hundreds or pallets of money, do you remember back when we were shipping pallets of hundreds to, I forget whether it was, I think it was Iraq, and they were just like, no one kept any track of these things. It's like
12
well,
billion fucking dollars.
Yeah. I mean, I'm still just kind of flabbergasted that that happened and no one.
I don't think there's a statute of limitations. I think you could actually, if you were actually, you know, of a mind, you could track the fucker down, whoever did that.
Anyway,
no, it's a crime that really should be prosecuted. I just think it should be prosecuted. Some of those idiots are dead now, but you know, I just think that you know,
it dilutes the wealth of all of us who actually have real money in our pocket. That's for sure.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for the.
Yes, I thank you for bringing that up, because in the first sways of the invasion of Afghanistan, I think $5 billion got distributed to the Northern Alliance that way.
Huh.
And the story was that there were CIA guys running around with SUVs full of, you know, pallets of cash.
Sounds right. That sounds like the way we operate. And of course, we didn't get our money's worth.
Of course we didn't. Well, it's Afghans. They're just, you know, they grow poppies.
Yeah.
They produce opium. What the
hell? They make good hash. Good hash too.
Yeah, and they're good at it. God.
Yeah. Okay, that was my comment, and thanks for the Marx rundown also.
I hope this was useful for some folks. Anyone else? 7 o'clock is the writing thing. After that is sports. Not sure whether is there more stuff tonight. I'm not sure. I think birding birding. You could have a Marxist analysis of birding, although it's pretty it's pre-capitalist. I mean, it's, you know, doing birding is no different than being a member of the Catholic Church before capitalism. Now, how can I say that? Essentially, all birding is doing is you're making constant lists of bird sightings, right? And it forms a kind of primitive capital in that sense. You know, that I mean, I'm not a birder, but it would seem to me that that's what you're doing with birding, is that you're spending what you think is useful time out there looking for birds. And then notating it.
I have a kind of question, I guess it's that you mentioned, and that's about when people say that, you know, communism failed, basically, like, you know, look at Russia or China or whatever. What's your best retort for that, so I can keep that in my armor?
Well, that it was, you know, it's unfortunate it failed. It did fail. It failed for a variety of reasons that are, you know, historical. I mean, you know, it's like trying to do something perfect when you don't have anything to work with. You know, it's a good idea, but they fucked it up. I mean, they fucked it up because they, you know, there's a variety of things that they fucked up. That's all. It's not perfect. But I think it can be perfect, because you can see at a small scale, utopian socialism works at a certain level. And I think a lot of people don't have the resources or the intelligence to get it to work properly, and it can work properly. That's what the anarchists say, is that at some moment we could get this all to work if we all, you know, sort of changed our behavior a little bit. Now, I don't know if that's the best answer, but the fact is that we're all fallible, and history, you know, allowed what was called communism, but was really actually existing socialism, to be relatively successful. And if you want to say that, if you want to even argue for success, you know, you just ask the question, who really won World War II? And it still is, I would assert, not D-Day landings and blah, blah. That's certainly part of it, but the Soviets, the Great Patriotic War was a really important war because they marshaled more people than the Allies, than the Western Allies, and had a larger body of technology, and just simply by volume crushed the Germans, who had already fucked up by trying to attack a country that obviously had a tremendous resources, and hoped to whatever seize the more interesting parts of the country, and they failed because they had an idiot running the military operation. That doesn't help. I know, because people are still anti-communist and blah blah blah, but it doesn't rationalize, because it's anti-communism is irrational in the context of the United States, because it just ultimately stuff happens, and you have entire movements of people trying to do shit for really wrong reasons, and you got to sort of free yourself from bad ideas, and there's always bad ideas running around. For example, I would assert that because Trotsky, I think, spent a little time in the United States, in New York specifically, that there are a whole fuckload of Trotskyists who are just Trotskyists for nostalgic reasons, and they're just idiots. This is not to offend anyone who is a Trotskyist.
Well, I'm sure you're saying that soothed a lot of feelings, man.
Well, some people would be bent on the shape of but as a member of the New Left, we always had jokes about trots, whatever.
I have trotted and I have skied in my life, but I'm not a Trotskyist.
Indeed. I don't get Trotskyism. I mean, I don't, because it's kind of this, it's like flat earthers. I mean, whatever. They're arguing for certain things that are very reasonable and important, but they kind of always fuck it up by, making it difficult to get anything done. They're sort of they're self-limiting in that sense.
Well, I also, if I could just add to what your answer was, did communism fail? Well, yeah, and it failed for internal reasons as well as external reasons. I mean, yes. It was born under invasion. It was an adaptation of Marx. Marx would not have chose the Soviet Union to start a communist revolution.
No, but he was interested in Russia, and that's, I think, why they were doing what they were doing.
Yeah. But I mean, according to his theory, it wasn't applicable there at that time.
Well, it could have worked. It could have worked had certain other things happened, but they didn't. So, and they had to terrorize a whole bunch of people. They killed 40,000 people in order to take that doesn't endear you to a lot of people if you have to purge, 40,000 people.
Cool. Well, I mean, revolutions do tend to result in bloodshed.
Oh, yeah. Well, and some people think it's justifiable. That's the Proud Boys approach, or the Trumpist approach. They don't give a shit about leftists.
Or the American approach in our revolution. I mean, we were willing to kill our cousins, right?
Oh yeah, hell yeah.
So, when there's a major change in government and policy, people tend to die.
Well, people die in both contexts. It's just that, at some moment you've got to have some consciousness about what's going on, and people who kind of think that it all can happen in a kind of evolutionary and bloodless manner are often mistaken. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, and there was nothing unique to the Russian Revolution in that sense.
Right, exactly. I mean, you can justify it by saying, well, there are X number of Western countries, some of which are monarchies, are pissed off that they went out and killed you know, and they killed royalty in order to get this done.
Yeah, sure. But I think, you know, and let's not also forget that the United States and its allies dedicated trillions of dollars worth of resources to defeating the Soviet Union. So, you know, you can't just look at it and say, well, they made mistakes. Yeah, they did make mistakes, but you know, a hell of a lot of it goes in from the opposition from all of the capitalist countries of the world.
Yes. And our current state is problematic for similar reasons. Let's put it that way. So if you look at the peace summit in Switzerland, you could say that, well, you know, it got some things done. There were some, you know, about 80 or 90% of the folks who were there signed off on, you know, defending Ukrainian sovereignty and trying to deal with refugee problems and blah, blah, blah. But there were a certain number of people who did not sign the communique, and surprise, surprise, are members of BRICS, for example. So you can see there's other issues at work.
Yeah.
In others, India showed up, but they didn't sign off on, you know, there are people have got all their own agendas going on.
Right.
And do you think it was good that Trotsky met his end in, I guess, Mexico?
Well, if he had met his end by, you know, accidentally having a car accident, that would be fine. But the reality is, you had a Stalinist. The NKVD sent somebody there to put the ice axe in his head.
Was that a
seriously,
positive or negative?
I mean, if he'd gotten run over by a truck or something, if he accidentally, you know, if he had an accidental land, I don't think things would not be quite as horrible as they are now.
Okay.
But in the other case, I mean, the fact that Trotsky spent a little time in the U.S., I think it makes some Trotskyist parties just sort of nostalgic that you know, it's here a little bit. You know, maybe we could get this to work here, and you know, it's just I don't know. It's like the John Birch Society or the LaRouches, or you know, I don't think it's that different personally. I mean, some people historically are committed to certain types of things. Like you have the RCP. There are RCP, you know, cadres elsewhere in the world, but the ones in America are just whack. You know, but they exist. You know, there was a little demonstration last weekend or 2 weekends ago of the RCP in what the fuck was it? It's either Germany or Britain. One of the two places. You had the RCP out there waving their little communist flags and etc. Russian flags, ostensibly. You know, weird. It's just weird. It's anachronistic. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me thank people for their attention. I apologize for occasionally flying off the handle, trying to, you know, wave my arms about this sort of stuff, and prompted, of course, by some of you. But I like thinking that's entertaining.